Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about A Practical Handbook for the Actor by Melissa Bruder, Lee Michael Cohn, Madeline Olnick, Nathaniel Pollock, Robert Previto, and Scott Ziegler. So I read this book because it was recommended to me, not me specifically, but to us as a group, because I participated in a workshop on directing plays through Zapkin Buskin Theater Company after I had directed at least one play, maybe two, I don't remember. But the workshop was led by Henry Morello, who I've been directed by now and seen several of his shows. And he recommended this book as a really good resource. I have a mixed opinion of it. On the one hand, I think there is some really good practical advice here, right? There's some practical suggestions, in particular about ways of sort of breaking up and analyzing scenes. So this is a big component of what they recommend. And so one of the sort of this is an important part. One of the fundamental presuppositions is basically a Stoic perspective of approaching acting. So what they say here early on is the best thing you can do for yourself as an actor is to clearly define and list those things that are your responsibilities and separate them from those things that are not. In other words, itemize what is within your control and what is not. And so the sort of general gist here is that as an actor, there's things that you can do, there's things that other people need to do, and then there are things that will be constrained, right? The text of the script is a constraint on what you as an actor can do. The director's direction is a constraint on what you can do, etc., right? So there are these sort of external factors, and one of their, I think, quite useful pieces of advice that sort of recurs throughout the book is don't trouble your head about the things that you cannot control. If the director says to do this scene in this way, do it in the way that the director says. If the script requires something, the script requires something, and it does not benefit you to be upset about that or to resist that in any way, right? You need to figure out what you have control over and what you don't have control over. And so one central thing that you can do is to analyze the scene. And they give a lot of sort of useful tips of like breaking up scripts into beats and then thinking about the function of that beat as an action. So, according to this chapter technique outline, action is what you go on stage to do, the physical process of trying to obtain a specific goal, often referred to as the objective. So basically the idea here, and again, I think this is a really, really good way of approaching it, is so you consider what it is that how you're orienting your performance and your performance choices. So the wrong question from this technique's perspective is the sort of stereotypical actor question, what's my motivation? Right? Because motivation is about sort of internal desire, internal sort of emotions, etc., etc. What do I want? It's not that. It's what do I want to do? What do I want to achieve? What is it that the character is trying to have happen in the world. So the idea basically is like, if it's my character is sad and I am going on to express that sadness. No, you fundamentally missed the objective here, because that's an emotional state, that's an internal state, but the audience does not have access to your internal state. What they have access to is your external state. So the question becomes, what are you trying to do to or with the world on the stage? And that often means, how are you interacting with other people on the stage? What are you trying to get from them or get them to do, or whatever it is, right? So this is the concept of an action. And I think that's a basically really good way of looking at a script or a beat. I don't 100% like or really understand the way that they sort of schematize this. So what I mean by that is, in the analyzing a scene section, they give you these 3 stages, right? What is the character literally doing? So that's just a flat description, right? This is what the character is doing. This character is returning home after searching for his children. So right now I'm playing Erroneous in our production, Sock and Buskin production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Erroneous' first scene, that's what he's doing, right? He's entering the stage, he's returning home after years away searching for his children. What is the essential action of what the character is doing in this scene? Walking towards the house. Now that gets interrupted by first Hysterium and then Pseudolus, but that is sort of the action of the first part of it, right? And this is a very simplistic one, right? Ideally, you would spend more time developing this, right? But the character is walking to his house. And I get that. 100%, that makes sense to me. But it's the third step that I don't really understand the purpose of. And it's worth noting that they set a bunch of conditions for actions. So it must be physically capable of being done, it must be fun to do, it must be specific, it must have its test in the other person, it must not be an errand, it must not presuppose any physical or emotional state, it must not be manipulative, it must have a cap, it must be in line with the intentions of the playwright. So realistically, probably walking to his house violates not being an errand and not having its test in the other person. But set that aside for the moment, right? Because that's just the example that came to me off the top of my head based on what I'm currently doing, right? So there's also an element of this that I think does not work for a show like Forum, and I do want to talk about that as well. But really, it's the third phase, right? So the first phase is describe on the most basic, sort of non-judgmental, objective level what the character is doing. Phase 2, what is the character's action? And again, the action needs to be something that is sort of measurable. Like, was this completed or not, right? And ideally it needs to sort of be rooted in the other person, right? How the other person reacts or responds or changes or what have you. A bit like rhetoric. So 3 is the bit that I don't understand. And 3 is, what is that action like to me? It's as if ... And I don't really get it. On the one hand, if this is something that okay, I can't conceptualize for myself what it would be like to be in this situation, So I'm going to find a simile for myself that allows this to be meaningful to me. But they say to always do this, even if this is something that, like, okay, yes, I understand what this character is doing, I understand what they're trying to achieve, I understand the actions they're going to take to achieve it, I don't really need a simile for it. And maybe this is my own sort of uncharitable approach to this, but I don't really see why it's beneficial to say, all right, I'm creating this distance from what is actually happening in the show to give this other conception, this other action that serves precisely the same function, right? So if we're going with the thing that I have set up, which is Erroneous is trying to get to his house, or trying to return to his house, I might say, for me, it's as if I am seeing an old friend that I haven't seen in years. And if that's helpful, I guess that's helpful, but I don't really see why it's crucial, right? If I can just be like, yeah, I can put myself in the position of someone who is coming back home after having been gone for a long time, then why do I benefit from thinking about it as though I'm seeing my friend I haven't seen in a long time? For me, it doesn't make that much sense. So there's that. Okay. That being said, there are a lot of, again, really practical elements to this. A lot of the time is spent on sort of scene, scene analysis, etc., etc. One other thing that I do have a problem with. I'm going to talk about two things I have a problem with, because there's really sort of two big things, I think, that really sort of bother me. One is the presuppositions of this acting methodology. And it may just be that this is not going to become my acting methodology, even though I have taken stuff from this book, right? I've learned from this book. So I'm not condemning it by any stretch of the imagination. But, like, they say here, for instance, in the chapter on externals, which means bodily adjustments, ornaments, and physical states. So basically, like, how are you sort of physically embodying your character? Do you have costumes, props, makeup, things like that affect your character? And then what sort of physical condition, like, is your character warm? Is your character cold? Is your character tired? All that stuff, right? So one of the things that they say here is, the more attention you call to any theatrical artifice, the less the audience will accept it, because you are calling attention to the artificial nature of the theater as a whole. That presupposes naturalistic acting, or realistic acting. That doesn't apply for farce. Forum is a farce. A lot of what we're doing very much breaks the fourth wall, meta-theatrically acknowledges that what we're doing is theater, what we're doing is a show, theater of the absurd, postmodern theater. All of these styles overtly draw attention to the artificiality of theater. So I think that's a problem, that they sort of assume as a broad basis that naturalistic acting is proper acting, right? And I think if it were put to the authors in that way, they almost certainly would not say, yes, we have that prejudice. But the way that that this is presented and the way in which the way in which the discussion of good and bad acting is set up seems consistently to assume naturalistic acting. Another assumption that they make, or another sort of presupposition that they have that I think is concerning, it comes in the tools of the craft most directly. There are other sort of hints of this. So, like, they give this list of things that a good actor needs: a strong, clear voice, good, clear speech, a strong, supple body, the ability to analyze a scene correctly, semantics, memorization by rote, the ability to work off the other person, the ability to act before you think, the ability to concentrate, bravery, will, common sense. And one of the things that they say prior to this list is, remember that it is within anyone's power to obtain any of these. All that's involved is hard work and practice. That's not necessarily true. I mean, they do say earlier on that anyone can be an actor, but you may have, say, a physical disability that prevents you from having a strong, supple body. You may have a speech defect that prevents you from having a strong, clear voice. And there are actors with disabilities, some of whom are fucking amazing, right? I've seen actors with disabilities, and they can be great, but they don't necessarily get the stuff on this list. Or, I mean, me, I'm clearly overweight. I don't have a strong, supple body. Yeah, theoretically, I could work really, really hard and hopefully lose weight. Although this book was written, I think, in 1986. So at that point, they did not necessarily have the sort of genetic information that we have today that tells us that weight has a lot to do with one's genetics and not as much necessarily to do with lifestyle as we once thought. But that sort of idea, right? That like, oh, if you don't have a strong, clear voice, a strong, supple body, that this is somehow you have not worked hard enough. There's very much a sort of bootstraps component to this. But then the other thing that I don't like about this book is it has a lot of the abstractions, right? They depend on abstractions in terms of what it is that an actor is supposed to do. So at the end of the list of these physical and cognitive and psychological characteristics is common sense. What does that mean? People like the phrase common sense because it sounds common. It sounds like common sense, that common sense is good. But what does it mean? Common sense is highly conditioned. It is highly culturally focused. And so what seems to me like common sense may not seem like common sense to you if you were raised differently than I was, if you were raised with a different worldview, different sets of values, etc., etc. And I think that's a big problem, is when you're dealing with these sorts of abstractions. We get this basically from the introduction, right? So David Mamet writes the introduction. And here's the thing. The people who wrote this book were students of David Mamet, which is fine, right? No problem there. But in the introduction, he says, this is the best book on acting written in the last 20 years. And they put that on the cover. Now, this is a minor thing. This is not the real point that I want to make. If one of my students wrote a book on rhetoric, say, and it was just basically sort of filled with the lessons that I had taught in my class, and I then wrote that it was the best book on rhetoric since Aristotle. People might see that as a slight conflict of interest, right? If I am endorsing my student's work because my student is saying the stuff that I have said, maybe that's not super trustworthy. But the real point that I wanted to make was that Mamet says this. Most acting teachers, unfortunately, are frauds, and they rely on your complicity to survive. This not only deprives you of positive training, but stifles your greatest gift as an artist, your sense of truth. What does that mean? Again, maybe this is the postmodernist in me, right? Or the maybe meta-modernist, since we're... Anyway, I don't want to get into that rabbit hole, right? But this is maybe the postmodernist in me that's saying, what do you mean by truth? My sense of truth is highly conditioned, in part by the things that I have been taught, right? This is not some innate, objective thing that is foundational to me and unshakable by time and circumstance. So what does that mean? And they do, again, sort of, they come back to this sort of idea of like, you have to act the truth, etc., etc. And in the conclusion, they say, many actors have spent their careers trading on and thus were limited by their natural talents. Many of these actors had successful careers, it's true, but few grew as artists because they never took the time to develop a set of skills they could call their own, skills that could never be taken from them. What does it mean that they never grew as artists? Right? So, on the one level, I get it, right? I get this sort of like, this is the world of theater, and we're talking about big ideas and truth and whatever, but you also have to recognize that this is an abstraction that does not really mean much. It does not actually tell us something specific and concrete. And it bothers me.